My story starts with Canada's Indian Act and the way in which I came to care about sexism as a Haudenosaunee man, even though I benefit from sexist patriarchy as a cisgendered male who's not impacted directly as a female person by those systems of inequality, privilege, and power. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Indian Act is an all encompassing and oppressive piece of legislation that has existed in Canada for 144 years since 1876. And Francis Henry and Carol Tater, both scholars of anti-racism in the Canadian context, they define the Indian Act quite eloquently. I always cite their work as a piece of federal law that has, quote, intruded on the lives and cultures of Indians more than any other law. So that although it's been amended repeatedly, the Act's fundamental provisions have scarcely changed since 1876. They give the state power that range from defining how one is born or naturalized into Indian status, or also administering the state of an Aboriginal person after death. The Act, in other words, gives Parliament control over Indian political structures, landholding patterns, and resource and economic development. The overall effect, in other words, as Carol Tater and Francis Henry have pointed out, is to subject Aboriginal people to the almost unfettered rule of federal bureaucrats in the Canadian context. So I would say that the Indian Act has had a profound effect on many Indigenous peoples and nations here in Canada after 1985 and until only recently, people acquired federal recognition under one of 7 different sections of the Indian Act. And so while there may be significant differences between each section, the major difference existed between section 6.1 and 6.2. And those sections produced legal inequalities between us as federally recognized peoples. Unless we married registered Indians ourselves, we could not, as the male or female children of women who had married non-Indians before 1985, confer Indian status onto our children under Section 6.2.
I wanted to hear more about how masculinity specifically came to become in the foreground of your analysis, because applying so many lenses, and there are so many ways, I think, to interpret the Indian Act through these multitude of lenses. So yeah, I'm curious about that journey.
Yeah. On early pages of the book, I think I talk a little bit about my intention to create this space from which we can begin to realize or think about an anti-colonial and anti-sexist literature that's written by Indigenous men affected by sexism. And that we all have a story, I think, as Indigenous men in that regard, right? I believe that this space for this emergence of this work could come from Indigenous men whose mothers have been targeted as Indigenous women. And I think that that's one thing that the Indian Act did. To hear from men, in other words, whose first thinking about sexism was motivated by the fact that they were Indigenous, not simply because of feminist theory, right? I think that that's interesting for me to think a little bit about. In other words, and I'll clarify on that point, that I think one of my earliest recollections of coming to care about sexism wasn't in fact tied to maybe any academic or scholarly pursuit, but instead this decision to examine sexism really began with when I first realized it and really started to think about that the history of the Indian Act had affected me personally because of my mother's gender, and also because of the everyday lived particularities that shape a person's experience, who's registered under the Indian Act. So it was when I think I started to think about like this complex and interlocking nature of sexism and racism that I realized that the history of sex discrimination in the Indian Act, in particular, the way it interlocks with histories of racialization, Indian status, was really aimed at our legislative assimilation as peoples. So, I would say that. I don't know if necessarily there should be anything that grants Indigenous men a monopoly over talking about the impact of sexism and patriarchy on our lives. I would say that it's significant, however, that in my nation, the Six Nations, we're matrilineal peoples traditionally, and meaning that we trace our ancestry through our grandmothers. And many of us, I think, in our hearts and minds, we wish to retain that matrilineal way of thinking. So while the Indian Act, I think, has endeavored at every turn to reverse and denigrate the very idea of women's power and influence,
Mm.
there is this element whereby inherent to masculinity, we've not forgotten how that is that we belong as people. So I would say that that's sort of where I was coming from, is wanting to sort of like think about, okay, like where could we start where realizing a non-patriarchal form of masculinity is concerned.
Mm.
And I think some of the book also around masculinity arose from the frustration of seeing, since I was younger, sort of the ways in which some of male political leadership, certainly not all, but some, right? The way in which they act when matters of sexism and Indian Act are raised. You know, I think it lacks critical thinking, but sometimes it's just an inability to connect the dots or to utilize intersectional ways of knowing, right? So I think my theorization about masculinity in the book is really concerned with finding some answers to a central question, and that is, what versions are at our disposal for non-patriarchal cisgendered masculinity to exist?